What we're doing in Module 4 is taking a look at the three big criteria areas in the diagnosis of ASD and the specific skills within those that are being evaluated in order to do a real diagnostic kind of evaluation. And then more importantly, discovering the strengths and weaknesses that we can then base programming upon, which is our ultimate goal. So we're going to begin looking at social behaviors. When we look at the social behavior criteria, obviously it needs to vary quite significantly from that of typical children of the same age, or we wouldn't be looking at a diagnosis of ASD. To really get a good look at this kind of impairment, it typically is best evaluated after the age of 3, although with retrospective studies, we've seen signs earlier than that. The criteria, again, and we've talked about these earlier at the very beginning of the course, but within the realm of social behavior in particular, needs to include at least 2 of the following things you see on this slide. So we see a lack of eye contact, atypical expressions and gestures, not developing peer relationships, not looking for that shared kind of enjoyment or interests, and a lack of reciprocity. Because we now have such a broad spectrum within the diagnostic criteria, many individuals are being diagnosed later than they previously had been. And so a lot of this information may be reported retrospectively but not assessed as early as it is with more severe cases of ASD. So those retrospective studies have really provided a lot of information that's been used in the screening measures that you've already looked into, and we're going to briefly take a look at just a kind of an inventory of screening measures that are specifically designed for that early screening of social behavior difficulties. Again, as has been the case with everything we've talked about this semester, we have some standardized sorts of testing materials that are normed. In the screening process, often it's parental reports and then very specific professional observations. We would not make any sort of diagnosis based on any of these instruments alone. And again, we're only now looking in this particular chapter at one of the 3 major diagnostic criteria. So we've already covered screening. I just wanted to give you a list to make you familiar with the names of the screening instruments that are most specifically intended to look into social behavioral traits. These are from the very young infants through toddlers. And you'll notice that some of the names of these instruments will probably change with the changing umbrella of ASD. And in some cases, you'll still see terms like Asperger's used in the names of different instruments. Again, like many things we're trying to measure in very young children, it's unstable very early on because we can get such a small sample of behaviors. And while we know even very young infants begin to interact with us socially, it's very subtle at times to make real judgments about the quality of those interactions. When we move from the screening phase because of concerns that remain after screening's been done, then a full diagnostic battery would obviously again be the next step, as we discussed in the earlier chapters. So there are those standardized normed instruments for certain. The other pieces that we haven't touched on much within the broad diagnostic battery would be a look at IQ or developmental sorts of testing, and we'll talk more about that in Chapter 8. And then we'll also discuss specific language tests in Chapter 7. And anytime we're looking at developmental or intelligence testing, we have to look at daily living skills. And in this case, we're talking not just about adaptive behavior, but about behavior in general, so that we can capture that domain of the diagnosis if there are unique and stereotypic behaviors. The two gold standard diagnostic systems you've seen before, but just a reminder that if this is the process for diagnosis that's being used with a singular instrument that pulls so much of this information together, these two are the instruments that most people would recognize as best practice: the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised and the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. Again, many professionals pull together information from multiple standardized tests and observations to gather the same pieces together and integrate them that these instruments use. The cognitive and developmental evaluations, again, with very young children, we would not find a stable IQ, obviously, but we could do a developmental evaluation. The big classic IQ test listed here, the WISC, the Binet, and the Woodcock-Johnson, some portion of those, because they have many subscales, will tap into social understanding to some degree. So that gives us another look at this particular domain, in addition to looking at overall cognitive functioning. But again, we'll revisit this in Chapter 8. And then taking a look at adaptive behavior is critical to looking at whether or not we have an intellectual disability at work as well. And so these are the most prevalent adaptive behavior scales that you would typically see, and the Vineland might be the most used of these three as well. And we've talked about these earlier as also with regard to the use of the checklist, getting this information from the home, from the school, in as many environments as possible. The authors in this chapter do some historical review, and just to touch on again the fact that the early research with regard to attachment and folks with autism has been widely disregarded. There was the whole theory that I may have mentioned in an earlier slide presentation with regard to refrigerator moms, and trying to explain some of the characteristics of ASD based upon the inability to make an attachment to a parent. Those studies have been challenged, and there is a call to have greater studies looking at this topic continue, but it becomes a question of how does that relationship form? What comes first? The lack of the relationship, or the relationship perhaps being different because of the innate characteristics of someone on the spectrum, particularly those at the more severe end of the spectrum. But most studies look at the social problem-solving difficulties, and often difficulty with empathy, even in folks who are very high-functioning. So this, again, in the new DSM, is a required diagnostic criteria that these social characteristics or difficulties be apparent before a diagnosis is made. But we're looking at them much differently than people looked at them years ago when they were first studying autism. And this brings us to the theory of the mind, which is a widely held kind of philosophy around what's happening with people who have autism and how we might explain, particularly their social interactions. And in the theory of the mind, it's referring to a person's ability to understand their social world. So having the awareness that's shared by most to have typical social interactions. And it's a very subtle awareness in many cases. So we know that people with ASD have difficulty recognizing the feelings sometimes, or the mood or the emotions of others, but also of themselves. So theory of the mind is speaking to how much you really can get a grasp of how you feel and understand the interactions of how you feel and others feel at the same time. when we talk about this difficulty of integrating cross-modal information, it's talking about things as basic as reading a person's expression, as well as the words they're saying, the inflection in their voice, other nonverbals, and putting it all together. And most of us do that without giving it a second thought. Becomes very natural, and we've really learned to start doing these things as infants. But for folks with ASD, those are disconnected sorts of pieces of information very often that are either misinterpreted or not interpreted at all. And so it's that inability to kind of pick those subtle cues up, see how they fit together. I mean, you can imagine when someone is saying something ironic, for example, and the reason you know they aren't serious is because you're reading their expression or their body language or their tone, and how confusing that would be for someone who has difficulty integrating all of that information. So this obviously would interfere with lots of reciprocal social interactions or behavior among people in a social setting or really in any communicative setting.